Well, good morning. We are so glad you joined us here today. At the end of this series we've been in, all about relationships that we've been calling Let the Games Begin. And you know, the entire time we've been in this series, I've been thinking a lot about my family growing up because we are incredibly competitive people. I mean, it didn't matter if it was a family game night or playing basketball out in the driveway or even these big kickball tournaments we do on everyone's birthday. We would always get into these very intense debates or arguments about the rules of the game and who was or who wasn't following the rules, and they get very intense and heated, and at some point, someone, probably me, ended up crying, and that's actually how we knew the game was over. It wasn't when somebody won or lost, it was when they cried so much they questioned whether they even wanted to be in this family in the first place. It was good times. But my wife and I started dating when we were about 15, and I still remember the first family game night she got to be a part of. I was very nervous because I thought it was going to be a lot like Culture Shock for her, and it was, because we ended up playing that game Cranium, and I don't know if you've ever played Cranium, but even in the rules of Cranium, it says, hey, if there's a dispute over the rules, don't let it get to be too big of a deal, because the rules don't really matter. It's all about having fun. And the Martin said, that's bogus. The rules are the only thing that matter. And so we ended up about halfway through the game getting into this very intense, very heated debate about the rules and who wasn't following the rules. And at some point, someone, probably me, ended up crying. And I remember my wife at the end of that going, man, your family takes game night very seriously. And I was like, of course we do, honey, because games are not about fun. I mean, they're not fun. It's not even about winning or losing, because a true victory is when you crush your opponent's spirit so mightily, they question why they even thought they could challenge you in the first place. My wife said, that's the most romantic thing I've ever heard anybody say. Would you read that at our wedding? And I did. And things are going all right. And see, we laugh about that because in a game, that mentality works, right? It's okay to be competitive because we have to have a winner and a loser. And the goal of every game is to what? It's to win. And if you said anything other than win, it's just un-American. But in this series, we've been saying that over and over again, we don't want this kind of competitive mentality in our marriages. We don't want this in our parenting, in our relationships with coworkers and friends, because in my relationships, I don't want a winner and a loser, because if anybody loses, we all lose. I want a win-win situation where the relationship itself is the win. We don't want opponents or competitors. We want a partnership. And so the past 2 weeks, Jason has done a great job of really explaining about two different games that we have to stop playing in our relationships so we can have the kind of relationships we were made to have. In the first week, he talked about stopping the change game. This idea that in my relationships with you, I can't pressure you or manipulate you into changing behavior that really I just don't like, because that kind of change it's short-lived, and in the end, it does damage to you or to our relationship. The only person I can change is me. And so if it's not that big of a deal, if it's not sinful or it's not hurting them or hurting somebody else, I got to let it go, and I got to focus on the change I want to see in me. And then last week, he talked about quitting the blame game, this idea that we've got to stop blaming all of our problems and the problems in a relationship on another person, that I really have to own up to my part of the problem. And remember, he used our whiteboard, and he drew and said, you got to own up to your piece of the pie, that ultimately when we blame, we always stay the same. And I bet you remember that rhyme, because in the end, it actually is so true that nothing changes in me, nothing changes in our relationship if I don't own up to my part of the problem. And today I want to wrap up our series by talking about one more game that I think is equally responsible for a lot of the arguments in our relationships, and that game is the mind game. And I think whenever we hear mind games, we actually end up thinking of things that are pretty similar to the change game that Jason talked about. It's those games we play when a person tries to control or tries to influence or manipulate how another person thinks or feels in order to control what they do. You've probably had some of these mind games played on you, and you've probably played some yourself. They're things like emotional manipulation and guilt trips and the silent treatment when I don't get what I want. It can even be things like sarcastic or passive-aggressive comments to attack someone else when I don't like their behavior. And the goal is to try and control or to change someone's behavior that I don't like, ultimately without them even knowing about it. And if that sounds familiar, it's because that's a little bit of what Jason talked about in the week he talked about the change game. And so I'm not really going to spend time talking about these kind of mind games today because, one, Jason already did a great job, and you can find those messages on our Facebook page or on our website. And two, all I have to say about it is stop it. Stop playing these mind games. The kind of mind game I want to spend my time talking about today is not ones that we play on other people or that they play on us. It's the ones we end up playing in our own minds. This mind game happens whenever someone says or does one thing, but I begin to feel like maybe they really meant or secretly meant something else. And I begin trying to figure out what they really meant. I begin trying to interpret what they did, and I end up misinterpreting what they did or said, and I end up overreacting and getting into something bigger and uglier than I meant. And here's what I think it looks like. A person right here does or says something. They commit an action. And this action can be a comment or a joke that they make that seemed a little pointed or personal to you, and you thought, oh, maybe they're saying something about me. Or it's a question they asked that seemed a little bit like a trap, and you weren't sure what to say. Or maybe it was the tone of their voice. They were a little too sarcastic or a little too sharp. Or maybe it was the way they worded a text message. Or maybe it was something they did or something they didn't do. You know, they didn't show up for something, or you had an expectation and they didn't meet it. And you could have considered this a harmless or innocent action, or it could have been considered a mistake. But for whatever reason, you're here on the other side of this. And you have a longer torso, it looks like, and you have a feeling. And your feeling is, I think something else is going on here. And I mean, I think maybe they were trying to send me a message by what they said or did. And you begin to, hear something different than what they actually said. They said this, but you heard this, and you begin to feel attacked or insulted or offended, or your feelings get hurt. And so you begin trying to figure out what is it that you actually meant, because clearly something else is going on. And whenever there's a gap between what someone said and what they did and what I feel like they really meant behind it, this gap here is a gap that is open to interpretation, which is a hard word to spell when you're talking. But an interpretation is really just a story that you tell yourself when you don't really know why someone did what they did or why they said what they said, but you want to figure it out. And so your interpretation is based on your feelings. I feel like they maybe meant this, and so you allow your feelings to create a motive for what this person said, what they did, and you begin believing, hey, this is what they really meant when they said that. This is what they really meant when they did that. And you end up responding not to the thing they did or said, but to the motive, the story, the interpretation that you created for them. And what ends up happening is you take what on the outside was just an innocent comment or an innocent action, and you make it bigger and uglier in your mind than you had to. And I know this looks a little confusing, so we actually saw how this thing plays out in real life in that video earlier in the service with the texting misunderstanding. I mean, it goes like this. A wife commits an action, which is she sends an innocent yes or no question to her husband. Are you going to cut the grass tonight? Are you still cutting the grass? And that's an innocent yes or no question, but for whatever reason, the husband begins to feel like maybe she meant something else behind it. Maybe there's something else going on. He reads the question, but he actually hears her say something else, and he thinks maybe this is a personal attack because he hasn't already cut the grass, or maybe he thinks it's a manipulative or nagging tactic to try and get him to cut the grass. And so he starts coming up with an interpretation, a story of what she really meant, a motive for her. And we saw him do that. He started saying things like, she just thinks I'm lazy and she has to manipulate me, or, she's nagging me because she doesn't respect me, or, she cares more about the lawn than she does her own husband. And so instead of responding to her action, her question, He sends back an angry text full of emotionally loaded language that is responding to the motive, the story he created. And we don't even have to know the end of that video. We know that's going to turn into a big, ugly argument. And I don't want to talk about you because I don't know you, but if you're anything like me, you've been in a lot of arguments, a lot of situations that look like this, where you took something small and insignificant and you made it bigger and uglier than it should have been. And the argument goes in 1,000 different directions, and you're bringing up things that happened 10 years ago, and you get to the end of it, and don't you at some point ask, wait, what were we even arguing about in the first place? Was I so angry about a text message? Did I get so upset about having to mow the lawn? Or did I really yell at my mom and dad because they asked who I was hanging out with and I thought that was none of their business? Or did I really yell at my kid about what they were wearing to school and what that said about me as a mom? Or did I get so angry that he or she forgot to fill the car up with gas and that was an inconvenience for me that they didn't think about me? Or did we really argue so long because they had the wrong tone of voice or the wrong choice of words or they rolled their eyes at me? And see, the reason we can relate to that, the reason we've all been in these big, ugly arguments over something so small is because we play a mind game. And that mind game is that I assume the worst about the people I love the most important relationships in my life. I end up assuming the worst about them. Now, we're all adults, so we know what happens when we assume. I'm not asking what it makes of you and me, because if I say that from the stage, they probably won't let me get back up here again. What I'm asking is, what is an assumption? What really happens when we make an assumption? Well, an assumption ultimately is just an interpretation. An assumption is a story I tell myself when I don't really know all that happened, that I don't have all the facts, but man, I got an idea of what happened. And even if it's based on logic, even if it's based on who this person is or my past experience, when I don't really know if my assumption is true, but I begin to believe, I begin to live as if my assumption is the truth, an assumption ultimately is a lie. An assumption is ultimately a lie that I believe, and I take what could be considered on the outside just a harmless or innocent thing, and I assume there's something else going on. In fact, I begin to assume, hey, you did this because you wanted to hurt my feelings. You did this because you don't care about me, or you wanted to attack me, or you wanted to manipulate me. And we react not to the thing they actually said or did, but to the thing we feel like they secretly meant. This is why a teenager comes home from school one day and mom or dad asks, hey, do you have homework? Which, if you have a teenager, you know that's like the question that starts World War III, because they begin flipping out and yelling about it, because this is what they hear when you ask that question. This is a trick question. In fact, they're trying to trap me right here because they know I wasn't going to do the homework. Or, you know what, they're nagging me because they think they have to check up on me like I'm some kind of baby. And now I'm feeling offended that you think I'm a baby, because I'm not a baby. I'm 13 years old. And a big ugly argument starts. Why? Well, that wasn't what the question was about. And we've all been on different sides of that kind of argument where we've either misinterpreted what someone said, or we got misinterpreted. And we know at the end, that was all pointless. Why did we do that? But before you think it's just teenagers who do this, think about this one. 16-year-old texts his mom, hey, the guys want to go to a movie tonight. Are you cool if I go? Well, that's an innocent yes or no question, just needing some information. What mom reads when she reads that text is, I don't care about the fact that maybe you had a movie or family night planned for us. In fact, I don't care about you at all, and I don't love you because I'm selfish and inconsiderate and careless, and you know what, you're just getting too old for me to hang out with. And so mom gets her feelings hurt, and she responds back with, well, I guess if you care more about spending time with your friends than you do your mother, who spent 38 hours in labor with you, then that's fine by me. The kid reads it, and he thinks, well, she said she's fine with it, guys, so I guess we're good to go. No, he's stupid, but he's not that stupid. You see, he reads that and he thinks, what is going on? Where did that come from? It was just a question. I was just wanting information, but now there's all this tension and mistrust in our relationship. And this happens in almost every relationship in our lives. Coworkers and bosses and neighbors and friends, it doesn't matter. We react not to what people actually did or said, but to the assumption we've made about them, which leads to these big, ugly arguments. And we end up with relationships that are full of hurt feelings and bitterness and resentment. And we don't trust each other, and we're always in these big, ugly arguments, fighting for the upper hand so we can get what we think we want, when what we both really want is a relationship that is full of love and joy and acceptance, where both people are fully for the good of the other person. And instead of assuming the worst about each other, we believe the best about each other. But when we play these kind of mind games, we don't get those kind of relationships. And so don't you think a God who loves us and who cares about us wants more for us and our relationships than this? You know, I don't know what it is you believe about God. In fact, that's one of the things I love about our church is this really is a place that no matter what you believe, you're welcome here. And a lot of you are just trying to figure out this whole God thing. And so maybe you believe what I kind of had believed growing up about God, that he was just a God full of rules and restrictions, and that his love was really conditional on you doing the right things and believing the right things and praying the right things. And if that's kind of where you're at, or you're trying to figure out this whole God thing, I really hope you'll come back next week for our series called The God I Wish You Knew, because we're going to address a lot of those ideas, and we're going to do that by looking at the God we see in Jesus and in the Bible. And the God we see in Jesus is that God is for us and that he loves us. I mean, no matter who we are or what we've done or what we believe, his greatest desire is to have a relationship with us, for us to love him and to love other people the way he loves. In fact, Jesus once said that the most important rules or commands in the Bible are to love God with everything you've got, your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, that you got to get that relationship with you and God right. But just as important as that relationship is your relationship with other people, that you have to love your neighbor as yourself. And later on, Jesus would clarify what this actually means and kind of elevate this command past loving someone as yourself. But he told his followers to love one another in the same way, or just as he loved them. That as followers of Jesus, we are called not to love based on how other people love us or based on what we think they deserve or even how we feel about them, because love isn't a feeling. Love is a choice. So we choose to love like Jesus loves. And so an early follower of Jesus named Paul wrote to a church in a place called Corinth, and it's collected in your Bibles as a book called 1 Corinthians. And he's really explaining how to love like Jesus. And these words have become so famous that, you know, if you're here today and you're not even much of a Bible person, I bet you've heard these words before. Maybe read at a wedding or at your wedding or on a t-shirt or like on a Facebook post where someone told you that, you know, you got to share this or Jesus is going to, I don't know, like come out of the screen and kill a dolphin or something like that. I don't know. I'm not saying he'd do that. I'm just saying that's what the post said. And what Paul is doing in these very famous verses is that he's trying to make it clear that, hey, love is not conditional on how you feel, because love is a choice you are called to make for the people in your lives. And it looks like this. So he writes, love is patient and kind. Love does not envy or boast. It is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way, meaning it doesn't always have to get what it wants. It's not irritable, or another version of this says it's not easily offended. It's not resentful. It doesn't hold a record of wrongs. It does not rejoice at wrongdoing, but rejoices with the truth. And if you notice, none of these things are really based on whether you feel them or not. They're choices we make. The other thing I notice every time I read this is, if I'm honest, I get more of this wrong than I'd like to admit, and maybe I'm not as good at loving as I think I am. I mean, it's easy for me to say, well, of course I love her. She's my wife. But I think Paul would say, do you treat her like this? Are you patient and kind with her? I mean, do you always have to get your own way? You ever hold a list of wrongs in the back of your mind so when you go into an argument, you got a lot of history to bring up? If so, that's not what love looks like. Or we say things like, of course I love them, they're my kids. Paul would say, well, are you patient and kind with them? Did you ever get easily offended at the things they do or they don't do that you think you deserve? You ever hold a record of wrongs against them? If so, that's not what love looks like. And you know this because we've all had somebody in our life tell us that they love us and that they care about us, but they didn't treat us at all like this list. And we knew, even before we knew there was a list, even before we read this, we knew, you don't really love me. You can say it, and maybe you love yourself, or you love the idea of me, or you love the feeling that I give you when I'm around you, but that's not really love. Because, love's not a feeling that's out of our control. It's not something I fall in and out of. Love is something I do. Love is a choice I make. And look, I'm not saying I'm perfect at this. None of us are perfect. I certainly am not perfect at this. I think the question Jesus would ask us, though, is because this is so important, are you working at this with your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength? Well, the list isn't complete. Paul finishes. Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things, and love never ends. And I think you got to admit, even if you don't believe all this God stuff, you got to admit that that's the best way for my marriage to be. That's the best way for my parenting to be, my relationships with coworkers and friends, that I would endure all things. I would hope and believe all things. That's the one I really want to focus on today, believes all things. Because I think that's the fix for these kind of mind games. What if we stopped assuming the worst about each other? What if we really stopped filling this interpretation gap here with an assumption that really is just a lie, and we filled this gap with a love that believes all things? And I don't know if you saw what I did right there, but I thought that was pretty, it really wasn't that cool, but I still did it, and I thought it was all right, and I thought it should be acknowledged. But believing all things, what that really means, what that comes down to is, I give someone the benefit of the doubt. That I assign the best motives to them, that when I don't really know why they did or why they didn't do something, instead of assigning bad motives to them, I believe maybe there's something I don't know. Maybe this is really for my good because they love me. Maybe they meant this for my good. What if every high school student stopped assuming the worst about their parents? What if they stopped assuming that my parents are just out to get me and to control me and to ruin all my fun, but really, they believed the best. They believed because my parents love me, maybe they have my best interest at heart. Maybe they're in this for my good. Wouldn't that change your relationship with your kid? What if every spouse entered into any conflict, and instead of assuming, hey, this person's going to say whatever it takes to win, so I got to say whatever it takes to win, they actually believe the best, that, hey, maybe this person's actually confronting me about something that I need to grow and change in because they love me, and I choose to believe the best about them. Wouldn't that change things? How would your friendships look if you didn't take every comment or every joke as a personal attack? How would every office look if you didn't think that everyone else was just ready to throw you under the bus, so you got to throw them under the bus first? How would your life look if you got into less arguments over stupid stuff like this because you didn't assume every text message or every wrong tone of voice or every wrong choice of words was some kind of hidden meaning, some kind of hidden message that was intended to attack you? And isn't this what we want? Whenever I say something, whenever I make a mistake, whenever I use the wrong tone of voice, whenever I use the wrong choice of words, I don't want to be misinterpreted. I want to be innocent until proven guilty, not assumed the worst about. Because when we assume the worst about each other, we're ready to fight. But when we believe the best, we are ready to love and serve each other. There was a guy named Marcus Buckingham who wrote about a group of social psychologists around the world who were studying these really great marriages. He said, I want to look at these long-lasting marriages that have the highest level of satisfaction and security and find out what makes them unique. And what they assumed they'd find is that they'd find couples who really just knew each other very well, because all these couples were somewhere between 10 and 15 years together, and they said they just know each other really well. They know their strengths, they know their weaknesses, and they could avoid the bad and highlight the good. But that's not actually what they found. In these long-lasting marriages with high levels of satisfaction, what they found were that husbands rated their wives' strengths higher than their wives rated their own strengths. And wives rated their husbands' strengths higher than the husbands rated their own strengths. This wasn't about really knowing the person. This wasn't about having all the facts. It was about believing the best about the other person. In fact, they believed better about the other person than that person believed about themselves. I mean, imagine that. Imagine if you thought your husband was a better driver than he thought he was. That would be some kind of modern miracle. It really would. But hey, that's what they're saying. They're saying in the best marriages or the best relationships in general, their relationships where love, in a sense, is almost blind or delusional. That when I choose to believe the best about you, I gain a deeper sense of security and confidence in our relationship because I believe, hey, we're in this together. We're going to make this work. And so I feel like I can open up about myself and be close to you, which leads to more intimacy in our relationship, makes it easier to love and serve you. And that instead of being in a relationship that we've all seen where people are just spiraling down towards a crash because they're always at each other's throat, they're always mistrusting one another, you're actually in a relationship that is spiraling up and you're growing closer together and you're actually growing as a person because I want to be the version of me that you see. I want to be as good as you believe I am. So Marcus Buckingham said the solution is to find the most generous explanation for each other's behavior and then believe it. Just choose to believe it. I mean, whenever I don't really know why someone did what they did or why they said what they said, I go with the best explanation I can come up with, not what I feel they secretly meant behind it. And this is in every relationship. I find the most generous explanation for my spouse, my children, my boss's behavior, and I just choose to believe it because what I choose to believe about you will determine how close we are. And what you choose to believe about me determines how close we are. And I know this is difficult. Trust me, this is something in my life that is so difficult for me to do, and I know it's going to be a process. And so I want to give us some things we can practice whenever we're in a position where someone does one thing, but I begin to assume that they really meant something else. And so the first step I think we have to take is the first thing I do is I admit my interpretation may lack some information. It may not be right, We have to use this powerful word that I think it's maybe. Maybe I don't have all the facts. Maybe I don't know all that I think I know. Maybe you didn't mean that the way it sounded. Maybe you weren't trying to hurt my feelings. Maybe even though I'm really upset and I'm really angry, maybe I'm wrong about my interpretation of what happened. That word maybe takes a lot of emotion, a lot of tension out of the situation. And so I admit, maybe I'm wrong, which is going to be painful for some of us like me who are always right. But you'll have to admit it. Maybe I don't know all that I think I know. Which leads to the second step I think we have to do, which is I choose. Love's a choice, so I choose to believe the best. As we've been saying, love is this choice that we make, so I choose to believe the best explanation for what happened. Even if I don't feel like it, I choose it. I choose to give you the benefit of the doubt. I may feel like you meant something sinister behind this, but I'm going to choose to believe the best because love isn't a feeling, it's a choice. And the truth is, if all this person's past behavior or you just have the inability to trust them and it keeps you from being able to choose, I think there's one more step that we have to take, is that I ask directly what I can't believe, which means I go to the person that I have the problem with, not another person who will back me up and gossip or vent with me about how wrongly this person has treated me. I go to the person and I ask a question, not to get them, not to trap them. I ask a question, which is, can you help me understand what you meant? I don't want to believe that sounded the way, you didn't mean that to sound that way. I don't want to believe that about you. So can you help me understand what you meant by this? The reason I go is because I want to go with gentleness and respect, not to trap them or to get them. It's ultimately because I want to be able to believe the best. And so I admit, hey, my interpretation lacks some information. I don't know all I think I know. And I choose to believe the best, and in the end, I ask directly so that I can choose to believe. The truth is, this is where, for a lot of us, we end up having a lot of these but what abouts, a lot of these exceptions we've had in our minds, probably the whole time I've been speaking, and I want to address a couple of those. Maybe you're thinking, but Nathan, I'm a parent, and I got a 16-year-old, and he's got keys and a car and a curfew, but he don't care about that last one. I mean, he's supposed to be home at 11, and he's walking in at 1 in the morning. And you're telling me I'm just supposed to believe that he's doing the best stuff at 1 in the morning? No one is doing their best stuff at 1 in the morning. Well, I think an important thing to say here is that believing the best about someone doesn't mean you don't have boundaries in your relationship. All healthy relationships have boundaries, and you as a parent have been given the responsibility to set boundaries for your children. So if the boundary is at 11 o'clock you're home, at 11:05 or 11:15, there's a consequence for crossing that boundary. But it's clear. Everyone knows what it's going to be. But between 9 and 11, believing the best ultimately comes down to, I'm not walking around telling everyone else about how this person's going to let me down and they're not going to ever get it right. I'm not telling my spouse or other people that they're going to mess up. I'm not playing out arguments in my head about all the things this person's done wrong to me and what I'm going to say when they come home late. I'm certainly not texting them going, hey, it's 10 o'clock. You're supposed to be home at 11. Hope you're on your way because you don't want to mess this up, big boy. No, believing the best means I believe the best, and if they come home at 11:15, there's a consequence. But once they face the consequence for their action, I then choose to believe, now you're going to grow and you're going to change and you're going to get it right, because I want to believe the best. But believing the best doesn't mean that there aren't boundaries, especially if you're dealing with someone who's dealing with addiction or has crossed physical or sexual or emotional boundaries with abuse. Believing the best doesn't mean that there are no consequences for bad or abusive behavior. I mean, the boundary is, hey, as long as this behavior continues, as long as you keep hurting yourself with addiction or you hurt me with abuse, our relationship will not continue. And the consequence when that boundary is crossed is you've got to get help, or you got to go to rehab, or I'm calling the cops and I'm pressing charges, or I'm taking the kids and we're getting out of the house and we're limiting our contact with you. Believing the best doesn't mean that everyone gets to do whatever they want and there's no consequences at all and I don't get to say anything. Believing the best means that I have boundaries and that when those boundaries are crossed, there are consequences. But all hope isn't lost. Believing the best means that when I see that you're facing the consequences of your actions, I believe that you can grow and you can change. But until your behavior changes, until I see any growth, our relationship will not continue the same way. Because all healthy relationships have boundaries, and the best ones are ones where we choose to believe the best about each other. Because God's plan for our relationships is that they would be full of people who are for one another, who love and serve and forgive one another, who are patient and kind, and believe the best about each other. And for those of us who follow Jesus, the reason that we do this is because this is what Christ did for us. That while we were still sinners, when it would be easy to assume the worst about us and write us off completely, God believed the best about us. And he sent his only son to us to die for us. And so as followers of Jesus, we don't treat people the way they deserve to be treated or how they treat us or what we want to do. We treat other people how Jesus has treated us. And he's called us to stop the mind games, to stop assuming the worst, and to choose to believe the best. Would you bow your heads and pray with me? Heavenly Father, we are so thankful for the fact that when it would have been so easy to assume the worst about us, you chose to believe the best, and you sent Jesus to us. God, I pray that we can follow his example in our relationships, that even though we have clear boundaries set up, that we would choose to believe the best about the people in our lives. That we would give them the benefit of the doubt, we'd give them the best explanation for what happened. Because we want to stop the mind games so we can have the relationships you intended us to have. We thank you for Jesus. It's in his name we pray. Amen.